Доброго дня усім ще раз, хто до нас доєднується. Ми розпочнемо 18:05, щоб дочекатися усіх, хто бажає сьогодні взяти участь у вебінарі. Отже, починаємо наш вебінар. Державна науково-технічна бібліотека України. Вітаю усіх учасників заходу, які долучились до нас на сьогоднішньому вебінарі на тему «Цифрові ідентифікатори установ ROR та GRID та їх роль у дослідницькому середовищі». Який відбувається за сприянням Міністерства освіти і науки України та присвячений Тижню науки в Україні. Модерувати сьогоднішній захід буду я, Аугуна Сабіна, завідувач відділу науково-методичної та комунікативної діяльності ДНТБ України, та Наталія Калюжна, головний бібліограф, яка відповідає за чат та блок запитань і відповідей.
Вітаю, дуже дякую, що всі долучились.
Щиро дякую нашим доповідачам Марії Голд із Каліфорнійської бібліотеки та Олександру Куджафу з Digital Science. And a special thanks to our fantastic keynote speakers Maria Gold from California Digital Library and Alexander Kudjaf from Digital Science for joining us today. Щодо структури вебінару, то захід триватиме 1 годину. Розпочнемо із вступного слова, потім 2 виступи по 20 хвилин, які будуть виголошені англійською мовою. У кінці вебінару у нас буде час для запитань та відповідей, тому, будь ласка, пишіть їх у чаті українською або англійською мовами. Ми обов'язково їх зачитаємо нашим доповідачам. Також ми повернемося до запитань, які ви вказали під час реєстрації. Вебінар відбувається з прямою трансляцією на YouTube-каналі, тому всі, хто дивиться трансляцію, долучайтесь до дискусії та пишіть свої коментарі. Оскільки ведеться запис вебінару, велике прохання слідкувати за вашими мікрофонами, вимикати їх, коли ви не виступаєте, та за потреби вимикати веб-камери. Отже, сьогодні ми поговоримо та розширимо наші знання про постійні ідентифікатори, зокрема про унікальні ідентифікатори дослідницьких організацій, адже у епоху цифрової наукової комунікації дослідницьке середовище надзвичайно залежить від мережі відкритих ідентифікаторів та інфраструктури метаданих. І якщо ми з вами добре знайомі із ідентифікатором для цифрових об'єктів та орки для авторів і науковців, то до ROR та GRID ID, які слугують для встановлення та відображення зв'язків між результатами досліджень та установами, все ще виникають деякі питання. Тож давайте розбиратися щодо цих ідентифікаторів. So let's get started. I'm inviting Maria Gold, ROR proєкт-менеджер, California Digital Library with the talk Registry of Research Organization ROR, History of Creation, Registration, Opportunities and Benefits of Use. Maria, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put up my slide. All right. So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Maria Gould. I am at California Digital Library at the University of California in the United States, and I lead the Research Organization Registry Initiative, which is also known as ROR. So today I will explain what ROR is, how ROR IDs are being used, and how you can get involved if you are interested in doing so. So what is ROR? ROR is a community-led registry of open, sustainable, usable, and unique identifiers for every research organization in the world. Now, why do we need something like ROR? I imagine that many of you joining this call today have previously or currently spent some time trying to find and identify which institutions are associated with specific research outputs or publications. And this is a question that comes up frequently in many different scenarios related to research. For example, publishers may wish to have data on the institutional affiliations of authors whose research they publish, so they can use this information for reporting or marketing or negotiating open access agreements. Or perhaps funders need to easily find all of the research they have supported so they can track the return on their investment. And institutions, especially libraries and research managers, need to collect the publications of their researchers for reporting purposes. So in theory, it should be easy to find all of the research associated with a given institution, but this is not always the case. And one reason is because many institution names associated with research publications can take different forms. So if you're only searching one version of the name, your results may not be complete. Or sometimes different institutions can have similar names, which can make it challenging to tell them apart and figure out which one is which. So a unique persistent identifier, such as a ROR ID, which I'm showing here, can always identify the institution in a standard and consistent way, even if different names are used. And ROR IDs can also help to distinguish between institutions that may have similar names. So ROR was developed to provide an open registry of organization identifiers to help disambiguate institution names and to help make research tracking more efficient and accessible for anyone. The ROR data is openly available in a public search interface that anyone can access. There are currently more than 100,000 records in the registry right now. We started the registry using seed data from GRID, and you'll hear about GRID after my presentation. And in addition to providing unique ROR IDs, the registry includes basic metadata about each organization, which helps with discoverability and interoperability. So this metadata includes alternate names for the organization, as well as location data and relationships to other organizations. ROR records also map to other organization identifiers, which helps with crosswalking between them, because we understand that different systems may use different identifiers or may use a combination, and we want to make it easy to go back and forth. The registry's focus is on identifying top-level affiliations for research. So this means that by design, the registry is not focused on including every single departmental unit within a university or other types of subsidiary units. So the focus is really on identifying that top-level affiliation that would be associated with a research output or publication. And the purpose of the registry is to provide these identifiers in order to make it easy or easier to connect organizations and research outputs. So I want to emphasize that the ROR ID is simply a piece of metadata. So if an organization is listed in ROR, it simply means that it has been or will be linked to research activities. So it's important to understand that inclusion in ROR does not signify anything about an organization's status or prestige. So ROR can be a supplement to other registries of organizations that do focus on rankings, but it's important to know that ROR is not a replacement for those types of registries, because the focus is on providing that identifier as a piece of metadata. So in addition to the open registry, ROR has an open API and a public data file to make it easy to integrate ROR into any system. And the code that is used to develop ROR is also openly available on GitHub. ROR is designed specifically to be implemented in research workflows as a mostly invisible piece of metadata operating in the background. So to provide a basic example, if you imagine a researcher submitting an article or a data set in a system that is integrated with ROR, the researcher actually doesn't have to know anything about ROR. The researcher doesn't need to know that ROR exists. The researcher can simply select an affiliation which comes from ROR's controlled list, and the ROR ID can then be stored in the system's database. And then the ROR ID can be included in metadata for the resulting research output. In most cases, this is going to mean metadata for a DOI. And then any system that harvests or indexes DOI metadata can make it possible to expose all of the research outputs where a specific ROR ID was used as an affiliation. So for instance, this is how it might look to a researcher submitting a data set to a repository. So the researcher is selecting an affiliation from the list, but to the researcher, it's actually invisible that the corresponding ROR ID for this institution is being captured in the system. And then here is some sample metadata for a DOI that includes the ROR ID in an affiliation field. So ROR is currently supported in the DataCite metadata schema for DOIs. It will soon be supported in Crossref's metadata schema. So that means that whenever DataCite and Crossref members submit DOI metadata, they can include ROR IDs for researcher affiliations. And in addition to being supported in DOI metadata, ROR is also being implemented in ORCID. So this means that it will ultimately be possible to more easily connect research by using all of these identifiers together to get a more complete picture. So I want to summarize and reiterate a few key points based on what I just went through to help you really understand the scope of ROR and understand how it is different from similar types of identifiers. So the first point is that ROR is simply an open registry of identifiers and metadata with some additional tools and services for interacting with the registry, like the open API and the public data dump. And the second point is that ROR IDs identify top-level affiliations and are designed to connect organizations to research outputs. So ROR IDs do not identify institutional hierarchies, and ROR IDs also do not indicate anything about the quality of an organization or its research. And lastly, I want to address a few points about what makes ROR a little different from other organization identifiers. So to summarize, ROR is distinct because it is fully open, because it is specifically focused on identifying affiliations, and because it is being developed and supported by community stakeholders. So these qualities make it unique, but we are still aiming to make sure that ROR is interoperable with other organization identifiers. So there are a number of ways to support ROR or to get involved if you are interested in doing so. And one of the ways in which you can contribute to shaping the registry is to suggest additions or changes. We have currently a form available on the ROR website. It is possible for anyone to submit feedback about records that could be added or changed in ROR. Those requests do not necessarily have to come from an institution. The institution itself, and we are reviewing these requests with a group of community advisors who help to determine if an addition to ROR is in scope. In other words, making sure it's not a request to add a department. And then if the request is to update metadata in an existing record, we're checking to make sure that checking the external website and other sources to make sure that those changes seem correct. So anyone can submit feedback, and we are aiming to make this a community-driven effort to curate the registry. So we appreciate everyone participating in that and sharing their suggestions and comments about how the registry data can be maintained and be best up to date. I do want to emphasize that I mentioned a little earlier that we launched the ROR data with the seed file from GRID. The two registries have essentially been linked to each other since ROR's initial launch, while ROR has been developing independent infrastructure to maintain the registry going forward. So we are reaching a point with ROR where we will have that independent curation infrastructure in place. But if you have, there have been some questions in the past around what has been in ROR or how the metadata has been selected. And a lot of this is due to, ROR really reflects a lot of the changes that GRID has made and decisions in that regard. So it's important to know that the two registries have essentially been linked to each other and mirrored. The plan all along was for ROR to become independent and to become a community-owned registry of this type of information. And I'm sure that Alex will talk a little bit more about that in his presentation. So helping to maintain the registry is one way in which you can support ROR and get involved. Another way to support ROR and get involved is to integrate ROR in your systems, or ask your service providers to integrate ROR in their systems. And there are a few different ways in which you can do that, whether using ROR for disambiguation or using ROR to produce metadata, such as when you register DOIs, or any systems that consume metadata using ROR IDs to identify the affiliations. And we also have a community advisory group that meets every other month, where we discuss project updates and give an opportunity for anyone to share feedback. So this is one of the best ways to stay up to date and involved in ROR on an ongoing basis. You are welcome to send an email to ROR. The email will be on the next slide if you're interested in joining the group, and I can add you to the list. So that concludes my discussion and introduction to ROR. I really appreciate everyone's interest and time, and appreciate the invitation to be here. And I think we're going to do questions after Alex's presentation, so I'm happy to address questions at that time.
Thank you very much for the great presentation, Maria. It was very informative. We already have some questions in the chat box, but we will return to the later. Щиро дякуємо Марії за цікаву та актуальну доповідь з корисною та практичною інформацією. А ми рухаємося далі. І наступна доповідь – переваги використання постійних ідентифікаторів GRID, доповідач Олександр Куджев. The next talk is by Alexander Kujev, Benefits of using GRID IDs. Alexander, please welcome.
Hi, thanks. I just get my slide deck started. So there we go. Nope, sorry, I didn't mean to share it. I didn't mean to present it, actually. So I'm Alex. I work for digital science. I work with grid and dimensions. I think you already know what grid means, what dimensions means. I will briefly touch that in later slides, but that just as a bit of a background. There's my email. If you're interested, if you have a question afterwards, feel free to reach out to me. Always happy to have a chat. Good. Next thing, or next slide, is what is GRID? I think you kind of might already know it, but nonetheless, I prepared a few slides for that. GRID stands for Global Research Identifier Database, and our claim is to catalog the world's research organizations. So much to that. So you know what the name actually means. And now what GRID actually is. GRID is a free and openly available database of research-related organizations. Again, our claim is to catalog the research-related organizations, and we say we want to catalog the world's research-related organizations. So we don't have a specific focus. We look at all the research-related organizations in the world. We currently, or with our last release, we're actually very proud to have crossed the line of 100,000 organizations that we have in GRID. So we now offer over 100,000 carefully curated organization records in the GRID database. Now a few words to why GRID actually is. So how did it come that we have started GRID? So a bit of the history. In 2015, we at Digital Science actually needed something like GRID. So an identifier for organizations, for research-related organizations. So the issue was there was none available. So none was freely and openly available. So there was just nothing. And we decided that we will basically step in the void and create such a resource, and then also make it free and make it available to everybody, so the whole research ecosystem could benefit. And that's exactly what we did. And this is why today I'm here to talk about GRID. The next 3 slides are about the 3 main missions of GRID as an organization identifier. There are 3 main missions that we have basically, or that we're following. And the first one is basically to ensure that data is consistent by providing a PID, so a persistent identifier for research-related organizations. Maria already had basically explained that use case, but here we go again. It's basically making sure that you are always perfectly consistent so that you can work with unambiguous data. So sometimes in some resource, let's say in an affiliation author string, you might refer to an organization in its local name. Another person might refer to it in a translated name or in an abbreviation or something. And by using an ID, you can actually resolve all of these names basically to one consistent ID and be sure in case you talk about the same organization or when you talk about a different or another organization. The next mission is to ensure robust reporting. So GRID also offers not only a PID, so a persistent identifier, but also other metadata. I will list it later, but one very important one is that we also add, or in the curation process, we also add other identifiers if we know about them, like ISNI IDs, ROR IDs, Wikidata IDs, etc. So whenever you basically have, let's say you have a local quiz system and you want to link your data to some external funding data, you use GRID internally, and the external funding data is actually using ISNI IDs. Okay, that's an issue because you can't do a crosswalk. With the GRID metadata, actually, you know that a certain GRID ID corresponds to a certain ISNI ID, and this way you can actually make the crosswalk and make the connection. And the last mission is to disambiguate your data. So basically, there is a lot, or there could be a lot of struggling, basically, if you work, for example, with duplicates in your data. Let's say you have, again, you have a local quiz system and you want to make a collaboration report in a certain scientific area, and you want to see what are my top collaborators. And you might actually need to identify it from, again, let's say publication author string. So you might run into issues if sometimes the organization is referred to by a certain author string, then by a translation of the organization, again, an abbreviation or a different name alternative. And by using, again, a GRID ID, you can be sure that you have covered or you have counted correctly your collaborations. I already talked a little bit about the metadata, what comes with GRID, and here's it more explicitly. So we not only offer a persistent identifier that comes with GRID, but also the organization name, type, maybe an alias, an acronym, the website URL, also location information. So something like city and state information, an organization hierarchy and relations to other organizations. Already mentioned as others identifiers, and actually there's even more metadata in it, but that's like the main information that come with GRID. And then this is how it looks like on the GRID website. I've just picked an example here that I thought you might be familiar with, hopefully way better than any particular German university, definitely. And there you can see it. On the top, there's a link to the GRID website. And on the very after this, what is it, 1, 2, 3, after the /, so grid.4405, 44.5, that's the not very human readable, but definitely machine readable GRID ID. So each organization is listed on the GRID website, and there we list all of the available metadata. You can directly link to them. And like you can see here, so if you just replace the GRID ID on the top there with another GRID ID, you get forwarded or you get it resolved to the respective other GRID organization. What you can also do, you can search on the GRID website for organization or filter for organizations, let's say in the Ukraine or in Germany or whatever. And here you get everything nicely listed. Some statistics, so what actually is in GRID as of this month. We have over 100,000 organizations. We've heard this now a couple of times, so sorry about that. Almost all of them, or exactly all of them, do have an address. We provide almost all of them with an organization type, geographic coordinates, etc., etc. So here's a little bit of an overview. If you're interested, this is a screenshot actually from the GRID website. So you can also look up the numbers exactly if you're interested. Then a little bit, I talked a little bit about, hey, this is GRID. This is why we have initiated GRID. This is why we actually run it. But now let's talk a little bit about what organization can be found in GRID specifically. So again, we focus on research-related organizations. Why do I say research-related? That's simply because there is, sometimes it's not always exactly black and white when an organization is a research organization or not, or when we can apply a specific filter to it, basically. Sometimes you have big companies who have their own research and development departments, and they do actively participate in academic publishing. Maybe also they receive, as a part of a scientific project, third-party funding from a certain funder. Maybe also they do have patents assigned, etc. So it still is a company. It's not their major drive to be a research and development company, but they do it to a certain extent. So this might qualify them actually to be a research-related organization. We ourselves, we use a data-driven approach to create or to identify these organization records and add them to GRID. And furthermore, very similar to ROR, you can also request organizations to be added via the GRID website. So we have a big button that says request new institute, and you can go on the website. I think some of you might have already done that, and request new organizations. So it's actually very easy to find on the website. Then, so how, or a few words that about that we take a look in GRID actually how the organization are viewed from an academic perspective. So that means organization that can be found in GRID, they must be notable, independent, and have a certain degree of continuity. Meaning they must be active in the academic world, basically. So for example, we don't actively add historic organizations that do no longer publish. It might be that they have been in GRID, but we also do not tend to actively engage in adding them, because we take a look at what is actually going on from an academic perspective. And so we try to complete GRID natively this way. That's also why we also similar to ROR. We do not capture any departmental level organizations, nor do we have any plans to add them. Simply also because we are actually a very small team with limited capacity, and we have a very hard time, or we would also have a very hard time actually maintaining and keeping these kind of information up to date. Again, we do have 100,000 research organization, that let alone keeps us quite busy. But then if you think about that, each of these organizations might have at least 5 faculties, multiple department institutions. So that's basically exponential growth of our curation needs, and that we try to limit it and make what we have available to the community. If you are curious about details on our policies, I linked them there for you, so you can go to the GRID website and read them up. Now let's take a little bit of a look at what you actually can do when you have such a thing, or an organization identifier like GRID, and what kind of cool things you can do with it. Here we take a specific look at Dimensions. Dimensions is also a portfolio company of digital science, and it's actually the world's largest linked research information data set. So in Dimensions, we do have content types like publication, grants, data sets, policy documents, clinical trials, and patents. And all of these content types are actually linked to organizations. So these are exactly these research-related organizations we talk about in GRID, for example, where we also resolve all of these different affiliations and make them available with the 3 main missions I was talking about. Here's a bit of an overview slide. Don't worry, I won't go through it, but just that you can see the scale of where these identifiers and the metadata is actually used and applied to. So we have, for example, 117 million publications, 135 patents. We do have authoring organization, we have publishers, we have funders, we have assignee organization, etc., etc. So these are millions of links that actually get resolved to GRID, and which is just as and very, it's a large use case. Well, it's maybe not large as when you spell it out, but in reality it becomes quite big when you think about of how much data actually can you can basically resolve through GRID and actually make sense of it. Now back from the real big focus, basically, and looking at the large numbers a bit, looking down into how is something like GRID actually applied in a very normal day-to-day use case, looking at publication affiliation strings. So I brought an example here. I tried to look something up with actually examples from the Ukraine, but apparently I have a certain language barrier, so I couldn't find very good examples. So please excuse me by using my default examples here. But for the human eye, you can see that the first 2 examples, that's actually pretty straightforward. You can very easily figure out that both of them are affiliated to the University of Cambridge in the UK, while the bottom one, that's affiliated to Harvard University in Cambridge in the US. So for a human, very easy to figure out, while for a computer, it kind of gets trickier, because as well as we want to have self-driving cars, etc., it still is quite a big challenge if you don't have something that helps you. And actually you have something that helps you, which is GRID. So if you actually resolve these organizations to the GRID ID, you can very easily, and also a computer can very easily see that the top 2 actually belongs to University of Cambridge via its respective GRID ID, and the bottom one isn't. So, and then it turns out also, well, affiliation string aren't hard anymore, so it's actually quite easy to figure this out now. And you can apply it, for example, again, to robust reporting, to disambiguate your data. So there's a million use cases that you can apply this to. And if you want to check it out, we actually have this disambiguation feature on our website. So all you need to do is Take, for example, an affiliation string, name of an organization, paste it in, click the disambiguating button, and then it gets resolved to the GRID record. And then again, you get forwarded. If you click on the link, you get forwarded to the GRID record and the metadata that you can see there. Another example then, and this is just one slide, don't worry. It's another example is how, for example, you can look at collaborations. Once you have disambiguated, so you have made sense and basically cleaned up all the author data, you can do and draw these kind of collaboration networks per scientific area. You can make sense of all your publications. You can have a look at how strong actually is my collaboration with a certain country, maybe with a certain organization. And that all comes with GRID, because with GRID, you also have not only the organization, but you have the metadata, you have the country, you have the city, etc., etc. Almost last slide is a little bit, it's a little bit bragging about who's using GRID, but it's first and foremost, it's letting you know that GRID is released under CC0, so it's under public domain. We publish everything on via our GRID website. You just go to grid.ac, you download the complete GRID database. It's available in CSV and JSON. You don't need a subscription. You don't need to sign up. There's no login required. You just get forwarded. If you want a previous release, even, we also have them all hosted on Figshare. And this is great because it works for a lot of people. There's a small taste to it, because the pity is we don't necessarily know who's using GRID for what, and would very much like to hear about it, because sometimes we only hear about it when somebody accidentally talks about it or similar. So it's very easy to get access to GRID and to use it. But please, if you do something cool with GRID, and please let us know. So we're on Twitter. So at best, just tweet at us. That would be really lovely. So we hear about who's using GRID. And that's about it. So you can either email me directly or contact us at contact@grid.ac. So much to that.
Many thanks for your presentation, Alexander. It was great. Дякуємо, Олександре, за чудовий виступ. So let's move on to the block of questions from the participants. Наталя, do we have any questions? Отже, переходимо до блоку із запитаннями. Наталя, чи є у наших учасників запитання до наших спікерів?
Так, ми маємо деякі запитання у чаті. Я думаю, ми розпочнемо з них. Отже, the first question in the chat box is, does ROR reflect hierarchy relationship within the institution? And I think Maria covered this question, but do you have anything, Maria, to add?
Yes, thank you. So I think that in the presentation, I addressed the notion of department level hierarchies, and I explained that that is not in scope for ROR, just as Alex explained how that is not in scope for GRID, given that the focus is on identifying the top level affiliations for research. That being said, there are some basic relationships in the ROR metadata to connect institutions, like a large university system and individual campuses. So there are some parent-child relationships that are available, as well as relationships across institutions. Those relationships are exposed in the ROR API. They're not exposed on the public, on the front-end search interface.
Yeah, thank you. Next question is, do you plan to expand ROR metadata and add other types of information? If yes, what would it be?
We are, for the time being, working on the structure that ROR inherited from GRID. The plan is to implement ROR's independent infrastructure for curation. We will be providing a JSON schema that anyone can use. And we are discussing with community users if there are future changes to the metadata fields that they would like to see. So that is an open conversation, but it is not an immediate plan at this time.
Okay, thank you. There is a participants ask, would you provide them with instructions on how to assign a ROR?
So the best way is to use the form on the ROR website to get in touch and make a suggestion, and then it will go through our curatorial process.
Okay, thank you.
I'll put the link in the chat.
Yes, next question here is again about the relationships, and it was already covered. Я скажу, що ROR не потрібно реєструвати окремо факультети, кафедри. Це якби цей реєстр, він створений не для цього, лише потрібно головну афіляцію, тобто головну установу. Okay. The next question is, there is a tendency of merging universities in Ukraine. What to do with their IDs, which were registered later? So can we merge them, or what to do in such situations? And this question will go to both registry, ROR, and GRID.
Alex, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I can. Sure. It very much depends on the nature of the merge, for example. It can be that one organization is so-called taken over by the other one. We have a redirect in GRID where one organization gets redirected. So basically, one organization is officially discontinued, and it will get an aid or close date, so to say, in GRID. We then apply that, and then we forward the record to the organization taking over the other one. It might be there is a new organization founded, and it's kind of similar. So the new organization is created, the other ones would forward to the other one. Or if they would just be merged as such, then that would probably also hint at the situation that a new one is founded. So either one of them is continued to exist, then one of the others get discontinued. That's how it is, or a new one is created and both of them are merged into it. And we try to basically resemble this, how it is in reality in GRID. So how a human basically would also model it.
Yes, thank you. Maria, do you have anything to add to this question?
So yeah, this is, as Alex mentioned, this is something that is inevitable, and it will, in ROR's case, similar to GRID, be handled depending on the nature of the situation, as far as whether a new ID, brand new record needs to be created, or whether one ends up being redirected to the other. But in any of these cases, it will be important to be able to have a historical record of those changes, and to redirect IDs to the new location if they have one, or to some sort of tombstone page if that particular ID reflects an organization that's no longer active.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have questions in the question box, but I want to read the question which our participants indicated during the registration. And there were such questions like, who is responsible for trustworthiness of GRID data?
Well, frankly, that is the GRID team. It's a team of humans, and what we do, for example, when we create a GRID record, as you've seen on the statistics page. So we have a lot of organizations, for example, where we have a URL, we might have actually some legacy organizations where we don't have them. But for new records, we always make sure that we have, for example, a website or kind of reference where we can look up that the organization actually exists. We look into the imprint where it's actually located. That's also especially important, for example, if where it's located legally, for example, like when we talk about a company with different firms around the globe. So where is the headquarter located, etc. So in essence, we always make sure we do have a reference. As you can also see, we do reference with other organizations. So for example, well, first of all, there is, of course, a certain level of trust that the things in GRID are not for actively false information. That, of course, you have to trust us that much. We do have a button on the website that lets you report issues. So if you find an issue, please let us know. By all means, please let us know. We always want to have up-to-date and correct information. We do look up every organization record. We make sure we look into the imprints. We look into sources that do help us. And we do also make sure we cross-reference, for example, with other registries or other information. So that also gives you kind of an indication that if an organization not only has a GRID ID, but we have reference to other registries as well, like ISNI or Crossref or whatever, that organization actually exists.
Yeah, thank you. And the last question is, who can request to make correction in the existing records? Should it be an authorized person on the behalf of the institution?
Well, in terms of GRID, it's we have the button all publicly available on the website. So effectively, everybody can request a correction. What we, of course, do, we check up on it. So when somebody tells us, well, that the organization changed its name to Clown University, we just don't take this over without checking the information. So we curate every record. We thoroughly look up every request. That actually, it takes some time, but it's definitely worth it. And so we can, because we're giving out GRID to the general public, right? And we want to be sure that it's good and quality information. So we check up everything, and everybody can request this, and please do. Whenever you find an issue, by all means, please let us know and give us the information.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Maria.
Yeah, I was just going to add in the case of ROR, the answer would be the same. Yes, it's possible for anyone to submit feedback. The model that we are implementing in ROR is a centralized but community-based approach to curating the registry. So that allows for, anyone who wants to submit feedback, and then it will go through a centralized review through curators in our community who represent different areas of expertise, and whether that's regional expertise or types of organizations or particular types of metadata. So we can make sure that the changes we're making in the registry are consistent, but also reflect the reality on the ground by verifying with institutions themselves or with other external data sources. So it's not quite as crowdsourced as something like Wikipedia, but it's also bringing in a layer of community-based curatorial review to the data that ROR holds.
Yes, thank you very much for the answers. Чи має ще хтось якісь запитання? Можете навіть, будь ласка, включатися і задавати або пишіть. Okay. At the moment, we don't have any immediate questions, so I think we can move on. And Sabina?
Отже, якщо запитань більш немає, тоді будемо підводити підсумки нашого вебінару. If our participants don't have questions, then we will summarize our webinar. A big thanks to our fantastic speakers, Maria Gold and Alexander Kudzev, for being with us today.
Yes, Alexander and Maria, thank you very much for bringing your expertise and experience and actually to make this event happen. We do appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everyone for your questions.
Same here. Thank you very much.
Дякуємо всім учасникам, які сьогодні були з нами та активно брали участь в обговоренні. Сподіваємося, ви отримали корисну інформацію. Також запрошуємо усіх учасників на наступний вебінар, який відбудеться 24 травня о 11 годині ранку по київському часу на тему «Ефективне використання постійних ідентифікаторів ДОІ і ССН і СБН в сучасній науковій комунікації видавців і авторів». Зареєстровані учасники отримають запис вебінару та перекладені матеріали презентації на українську мову на електронні скриньки, які були вказані під час реєстрації. Усім гарного вечора та до зустрічі на наступних наших вебінарах. Також долучайтеся, підписуйтесь на наші офіційні сторінки у соціальних мережах Facebook та Twitter, а також на YouTube-каналі, щоб слідкувати за нашими подіями. So, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.